Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good morning, or it's morning for me at least, here on the East Coast or West Coast, here from Washington. This is Tiffany Mink. I am the marketing manager at Interview Valet, and we're so excited to be here today. This is our first live in a while. We took some time off. We had a full day event in September, and we kind of regrouped from that, and we're so excited to be back doing one of these for you. We do have the chat over there. Let us know where you're at. Is it morning or afternoon for you, or maybe even evening? And please use the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout while we're here today, and we'll try to get to your questions. And if not, hold on to them till the end, and we will try to get everyone's question answered at that time. But today we're talking about why your podcast interviews are not converting. This is a big topic. You're doing the interviews. We know that they should convert. We know that they have high success rates, but sometimes you're not seeing those same results. So we're really excited to dive into that today. And so with that, let's get started. I know this is a fun topic, and I'm going to bring on Tom Schwab, our founder and CEO. Hey, Tom.
Hey, good afternoon, Tiffany, here on the East Coast time zone. And this LinkedIn Live got more signups than just about anyone we've had. And there were more people saying, I can't make it. Can I get the recording? Because, as we'll get into here, everybody is talking about, well, how do you get on podcast interviews? And, people are getting on, but they're not seeing the results. And at the end of the day, the goal is not just to get on podcasts, right? Right. It's to get results from being on podcasts. And we've got a lot of data and a lot of things to share on that.
Right. Yeah. Rarely ever has someone come to us and said, I only want to get on podcast. I don't want any results. I don't want to see anything from it. I just want to get on the podcast. So yeah, you're hoping to accomplish something. It's kind of the middle step to an end goal. So let's help people make those convert better and see better results.
Excellent. Well, I'll jump into it. Tiffany's going to be on the chat. I'll probably reference a few things. She'll put that in there. If you have any questions, put them in there, Tiffany, and we'll have a couple people from the team on there. We'll be able to respond to you there, because I tell you what, if I tried to read the chat at the same time, you will find out that Tom can't chew gum and walk at the same time. I'll just stop talking.
All right.
Well, let's jump into this. And what we're looking at here is, why aren't my podcast interviews converting? Right? I look at it as dominoes, and you start with the first one, and it's supposed to go all the way through, and there's something stopping that. Right? And like Tiffany said, the goal is not to get on a podcast interview, right? That's the means to get there. So I just want to real quickly at the very beginning, who's this for, right? This is for anybody that's based in a relationship sale, right? Where it's going to take a conversation to move someone from knowing about you to actually working with you. So this is nonfiction authors. This is high-level coaches, high-level consultants, brands. And these are people that have typically a regional or global or even a national audience, right? So if you're just trying to build your business in Kalamazoo, Michigan, podcast guesting is probably not ideal. If you're trying to sell a $5 widget, people don't have to get to know, like, and trust you. But if your basis for your business is relationships, getting that know, like, and trust, if you've built your business in the past on referrals, well, podcast interviews are referrals on steroids. The other thing is that while everyone on here maybe self-identifies, there's another thing that you self-identify. And I heard this from so many people after we put this up. You're doing interviews, but you're not seeing the results, right? You know that it should work. You hear other people talking about getting results, and you feel like you're the odd person out, right? Is it me? Is it that my business won't work? No, I can promise you that it's not you, right? We've had a lot of different people come through. We've worked with a lot of people, and the biggest thing is the system, right? You'll hear me say it later on. One of our core things at Interview Valet is our success is in our systems. The other thing too is don't take anybody's word for anything, right? Everybody's got an opinion, right? And why should my opinion count more than somebody else's? Well, I'm an engineer by degree, right? So I thank you to all the U.S. taxpayers that paid for my education to the Naval Academy. I'm a geek, and we take data on everything. So everything that I'm saying to you today is based up by data. And so Interview Valet, which is the largest podcast interview marketing agency in the world, right? We don't just do podcast guesting, we do interview marketing. So we've been doing that for 8 years, over 1,000 clients on over 50,000 interviews. And we've got data points on all of those. Now, early on, I wrote a book called Podcast Guest Profits, How to Build Your Business with the Targeted Interview Strategy, right? It's not just podcast guesting, but how do you grow your business? How do you grow your profits with this? So data comes from that. And then Interview Valet, right? We've got a team of 32 people now in North America and Europe. I always say my microphone makes me look good. I'm sorry, my microphone makes me sound good. My team makes me look good, right? And so we're all learning as we go, and we're really big on sharing what is working, right? Each year we do a study. It's called the State of Podcast Guesting, and that typically comes out in February, and that's pretty much the industry standard. So it's not just our opinions here. And some of it comes from the examples you'll see comes from large companies, right? I love working with a company like HubSpot. They could tell us their cost of lead acquisition, cost of customer acquisition by channel down to the penny, right? So brands that are really trying to grow, Acuity Scheduling worked with them very early on, and they were later bought by Squarespace. Other ones are smaller coaches, consultants, a lot of nonfiction authors that have a viewpoint that are trying to get out there. Podcast interview marketing works for that. The other one is we've worked with a lot of podcasters, right? The best place to find podcast listeners is listening to podcasts, right? So if you want to grow your podcast interview marketing works for that. So one foundation here, and I want to put this comment out to everybody. Can we all agree that the core problem is not getting on shows? Right? There's a lot of courses out there. There's a lot of people talking on, they will help you get on podcasts, right? And sometimes their numbers are incredibly inflated. Right. I get pitched every day. There's one out of Europe that I always like. They reach out to me about every 6 months, and they'll get me on any 8 podcasts. You know, another one says they'll get me on podcasts that get $250,000 downloads per episode. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty good, you know, because there's less than 50 of those in the world, and they're going to get me on those. Right. So the problem is not getting on shows, right? If you went to Facebook right now to one of the groups, I guarantee you, you can get an interview scheduled before we finish this LinkedIn Live, right? That's not the problem. The problem is getting results, and not just sporadic results, but results from each and every interview. Because if you're just throwing stuff at the wall, right? If you're just throwing darts, right? God help you if you get results from one. If you don't know why you got it, you'll never be able to reproduce it. And that'll almost be more frustrating than not getting any results, because now you know it works. I just can't get it to work, right? So we're going to go through this. And sometimes we get so focused in podcasting, right, that we forget the world in general. So I want to ask a question to you. If you had a problem, right? Say you're a farmer and you planted seeds this year and nothing grew. What would you do next year? Would the answer be, oh, I'm going to plant more crops, right? I'm going to rent more land to do that, right? It's probably just because yeah, I wasn't farming enough. I'll buy more equipment. I'll double down on it. Or what if you're doing Facebook ads, right? And all of a sudden, the Facebook ads aren't working nearly as well. Would you come back and say, I want to double down on that, right? I want to spend more and more money on that because I think what it is I'm not throwing enough money toward that. In the Navy, we used to call this doubling down on stupid, right? If something doesn't work, what you need to do is you really need to fix the problem before you start doing more things, right? Fix the problem, then go on, right? And a lot of times now, people will come back and say, well, more is better. What I need to do is more interviews, right? I just need more reps. Well, if it's not converting now, why would doing more of them just magically change? Nothing's going to magically change on its own, right? So some people say, I'll just do more. Well, more is not better. The other one, people will say, well, you know what I really need to do? I need to do bigger shows. That's the problem. I haven't been getting on big enough shows. And once again, let's take a step back here. You're talking at the local Kiwanis Club. Nobody is biting, right? You can't convert 1 out of 100. But now you're like, what I need to do is I need to be on Oprah. I need to be on Joe Rogan, something like that. Because if I was there, bigger, I would convert so much better. No, probably wouldn't, right? And you've got one chance at those bigger shows, right? When do you want to be on Oprah? Do you want to be on there when you've got your new book coming out, when you've got your products, all the rest of that? Or do you want to be on a year before when you've got nothing set up, right? You've got one chance. Make sure that it's the right time. So more is not better. Bigger is not better. You know what's better? Better is better. So let's do better interviews. Let's make sure that we're hitting all of the steps so that each one of those dominoes falls down. And I tell you what, when you start doing that, when you can get on any podcast and reliably drive results, that's when you just scale it up, right? That's when you start to look and say, let's do more podcasts. Let's do bigger podcasts because you're going to get a better result. Often people will come to us and we'll just say, start slow, right? You need to tune this up. You need to get better. We need to learn things on this. The people that come and say, can you get me on 100 interviews in a month? I often say I could, but you wouldn't want it, right? Because you wouldn't get the results out of it. One of the things you heard before that I said, and I'll keep coming to this. This is a key value of Interview Valet, that our success is proportional to our systems, right? You shouldn't be going on a podcast interview and not knowing what the results are. You shouldn't be winging it. It should be very easy in order to dial it in, make sure everything's working, and then ramp it up. So with that, let's jump in to the 10 common killers of podcast interview results. So the first one is targeting. Who do you target on a podcast? Are you targeting the podcast or are you targeting the listener? Right? And so often we'll find people that are targeting a podcast, right? I want to be on podcasts that talk about business coaching. Okay. There are those, right? But the problem is you're on there with every other business coach, right? And they might not have your ideal audience. So when you're targeting, you want to target the audience, not the podcast. Where would the audience be, right? Prime example of this. Early on, we had a business coach. He targeted people that were typically males, 40s, 50s, that one of his big things was work-life balance, right? And we got him on a podcast called 40 Plus Fitness. He looked at us and he's like, I'm not a fitness coach, right? Why would I be on this? And we explained to him, we are targeting your ideal customers, your ideal listeners, right? And these are people that are 40, they're male, largely. This is your audience. And he was able to go on there and say something like, it does you no good if you make your first million by the age of 30, if you make your first widow by the age of 40, right? You need that work-life balance. That converted better than anything else. The other thing that I see people messing with the targeting is they target the subject, not the audience, right? You always want to be targeting for your ideal audience. So I'll see people come out and say, I want to talk about mindfulness. Perfect, right? That's a great thing to talk about on podcast interviews. But who do you want to talk to? Do you want to talk to, young people? Do you want to talk about to business people? Do you want to talk to male or female? Do you want US versus overseas? Right. So often people will just say, this is what I talk about. I talk about leadership. Well, if you've got a product that's focused on lower level leaders, that's where you want to be talking to. If you're trying to sell consulting to Fortune 500 companies on leadership, you want to make sure that you're on the podcast they're listening to, not just generic leadership shows. So that's the first one. And through all of these, give yourself a ranking, right? Say, how do I think I do on this? Is it, am I a 1? Am I a 10? Is it good? Is it get bad? Because what you're going to want to do is figure out where the opportunities are. It's not taking it from a 9 to a 10. It's taking that one from a 2 to a 5 or 6, right? One of these dominoes is stopping your results. So let's jump into to number 2 here. So the second one is confusing and losing. I have listened to so many podcast interviews where I'm confused what they're trying to talk about. What is their focus? What is their goal for being there? And if I'm confused, I can only imagine the host is confused and the audience is confused, right? We can all talk about a lot of things, right? I can think of a prospect that came to us and he said, I can talk about a lot of things, right? Oh, I can talk about marriage. I'm a comedian. I can talk about what life on the road is there. I can talk about, helping people get into colleges of their choice. And I'm like, those are all very, very interesting things. But if you bounce around from one to another, people will think you're a jack of all trades and a master of none. There's a great quote by Admiral Stockdale. Admiral Stockdale was a senior POW in Vietnam. And when he was at his debate for the president, he was a vice presidential candidate. He started with these words. And these are the words that every podcast guest should know, and the audience should know. Who am I and why am I here? Make sure that everything you do supports that. If you confuse them, you'll lose them. If you confuse them, they will not take action. So that was number 2. Number 3. Lack of an emotional connection. Podcasts are a very intimate medium, right? You're in somebody's ears. They've chosen to have you there, right? Over everything they could be doing or listening to, they're focusing on you. And too often, I see people miss the opportunity to make a meaningful emotional connection. And there's 2 people, if you want to learn more about this, that have helped me in my life with this. The first one is Pat Quinn. Pat Quinn, not Pat Flynn. Pat Quinn is a presentation and speech coach out of Milwaukee. He does a lot of training with the Entrepreneurs Organization and with Pete Vargas's organization there. And what Pat teaches is that people connect with your head first, right? Oh, wow. Tiffany is smart, right? I'm going to listen to her. And then they connect with your heart, right? Wow. Tiffany understands me. She's like me. And the problem is we start with going from head to heart. And then at the end of the interview, we talk about, hey, now come and get my book, come back to my website. We go to their hands and the trust level drops there. The best thing to get an emotional connection is at the end of that podcast interview when they say, so Tiffany, how can people get in touch with you? Is to connect with people again, right? Connect with them, explain them why you do what you do, why it matters, right? You will find that that conversion rate is so much better. The sharing rate is so much better than if you just go out and pitch. The other one, Arthur Joseph. Arthur's got a great program called Vocal Awareness. Arthur has been a client, and I have learned so much from him. If you want to make a emotional connection at the end of the podcast interview, when they say, so Tom, how can people get in touch with you? Don't speed up and say, go here, go here, go here. I remember being on a call with Arthur one time, and we finished up the call, the end of the 30-minute call or whatever. And I said, Arthur, do this, and I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that. And Arthur's been the NFL or the speech coach for the NFL for over 3 decades, right? And we get to the end of it, and he's like, Tom, you have children, don't you? And I'm like, yeah, Arthur, I do. He's like, do they listen better when you speed up or you slow down? And I'm like, ooh, when I slow down? He said, do they convert better or listen better when you yell or you whisper? And I'm like, oh, if I whisper, slow down, and get on their level, they listen to every word. And he said, it's the same thing in communications. So at the end of podcast interviews, so many of us, and I say us because I tend to do this, right? When they say, so Tom, how can people get in touch with you? I've got this thing going on in the back of my mind that says, if I don't get this done, we're going to news and weather on the 5s, right? If someone, this is not radio. There's no clock there. And if someone is still there with you, they love you, right? If they didn't, they would have turned you off 30 or 45 minutes ago. So slow down. Do what Pat Quinn teaches, connect with them on an emotional level. Remind them that you're like them, right? That you care about them. Do what Arthur teaches. Slow down. Lean into the microphone. Talk about how you can help them, what the next thing you can do. I've seen people do this and it drastically, just this one thing in an interview, and it drastically improves their results. I'd encourage you to listen to your interviews and listen and try this on the next one. Next one, Groundhog's Day, right? Lack of fresh and engaging content, right? This often happens on book tours, right? Where somebody is talking about the same thing over and over. They'll do a dozen, 2 dozen, 5 dozen podcast interviews, and they all sound the same. Not only do they sound the same to the audience, right? They're not good. After they've heard 2, they won't look for another one because it's like, oh, I've heard this song already. But also from the guest perspective, they start phoning it in, right? We all get to that point where it's like, oh, I've said this before. I'll just say it again, and just going to talking points. And this is something that we really found out through the help of one of our clients. Jeff Madoff is a great guy. Very, very interesting. He's a college professor. He ran the video and the events for the biggest people in New York. Victoria's Secrets, Ralph Lauren, he was doing all of those shows. And he wrote this book called Creative Careers. And in the book, it's a summary of a lot of the things that he learned teaching the college course by the same subject. Well, trying to explain a book on a interview, you can't do it justice, right? How are you going to get into all of those things? So we worked with him, and I believe there's 13 chapters in his book. And we said, focus on one chapter in each interview, right? So make it engaging content, right? So on one interview, right? When time for coffee, he might talk with Andrea Koppel about, the myth of the lone genius. It takes a team, right? When he was on Tim Ferriss, he focused on something else, right? On the creative side of it. And it's not always what you start out with in college, but other things you can do. Success through failure. He talked about learning, that continual learning. And so each one, he could talk about something different, really focus on it for 30 or 45 minutes, and then say, that's just one of the themes that we talk about. If you want to hear more of it or understand more of it, just come back and get the book. Because if you've given me the summary of the book in 45 minutes, why would I need to get it? Why would I need to check you out more? And this worked not only in the US, but also in Europe when he was on Minter Dial's podcast and really dug into that. So I would challenge you, if I was to listen to your last 5 interviews, are they the same interview? Or do you have fresh content there? Number 5, what's the next step, right? Um, how can you help people if there's not a next step, right? You may be a great communicator, but I don't think you can share everybody's or solve everybody's problem in that 30 or 45 minutes, right? How do you help people to that next step? And often I'll hear people that will say, well, come back to my website and sign up for a newsletter. In 2022, does anybody want a newsletter? Right? Or other ones will say, go to Amazon and buy my book, right? Amazon's got enough traffic. You don't need to send them there also. And over the last 8 years, we've done a lot of testing. And this is going to be heresy, right? Because every digital marketer is going to tell you one call to action. And I don't disagree with them. If you are on social media, if you've got cold traffic, don't confuse them. Give them one call to action. But podcasts are different, right? Podcasts is more of a relationship. And so what we have found in all of our testing is that 3 calls to action always work best. Meet people where they are, right? Give them a small yes. This could be something they could download, they could check out. Checklists work really good. Assessments work really well, right? I can think of Chris McCluskey from Professional Christian Counseling. We worked with him and his team over the years. And one of the things I liked is he said, if I'm talking to you about, being a coach as a husband, right? Helping you as a husband. If you think you're a 9 out of 10, there's nothing I can do to help you, right? But if I say, come back, take this self-assessment. Here's 10 questions every man should ask themselves. You could do the same thing for every business owner, every whoever your target audience is, right? And if they take that and they realize, oh, shoot, I'm not a 9 out of 10, I'm a 4 out of 10. That will drive them forward. Also, sometimes these assessments can be easily shared, right? So maybe I don't need it, but I could share it with someone else that's an ideal customer. So that's that small yes. Doesn't take them a lot of time, doesn't take them a lot of money, right? The next one is the medium yes. Meet people where they are, right? If they're interested and want to give you a little bit more time or money, give them a way to do that. Now, this could be an entry-level product for you. It could be a book. It could be a face-to-camera video, something to build that relationship, right? For me, it's typically the book, and I give away my book because to me, my ideal customers, they value their time more than their money. So for them to download the book and read it, that's a pretty hefty size yes. Then finally, there's a great book by Bill Troy. It talks about whales don't click and big fish don't swim through funnels, right? It's quicksand, how digital marketing is ruining your business. If someone hears you and you are the answer to prayer, right? And they want to talk with you and they show up, right? If they show up with credit card in hand, wanting to talk to the wizard, let them talk to the wizard. Don't slow them down in a funnel, right? So if you're a coach or a consultant or a brand, right? Give them a way to go straight to your website, click on, get that discovery call, right? Because I guarantee you, if you were selling 5-figure consulting, 6-figure deals, right? That CEO, that decision maker is not going to hear you and then download your $7 tripwire product, right? He probably doesn't know how to do that. And if you slow him down there, he'll just go on to something else. Give him a small yes, a medium yes, and the heck yes. So those are the ideas of where you can, move them onto the next step. But then make sure that it's very easy for them to connect with you, right? I'm amazed sometimes when I hear people how hard they make it for people to connect with them. They'll say, you know, you can go to my Twitter here, you can go to my TikTok here, you can go to my LinkedIn, here's my phone number, here's my email. Now remember, 70% of all podcasts are listened to sped up. So you're saying it and they're not taking notes, right? They're multitasking. The chances of them remembering that is very, very tough, right? And we've done a lot of tests over the years on where the best place to send them is, right? We've tested, do you do text to download something? It's never converted well for us. Do you send them to a vanity URL? Well, you can do that, but you're going to lose all the SEO value on it. The best place that we have seen to send people is to what we call a dedicated welcome page. You want evergreen content directed to an evergreen page. So let me give you an example, right? So I'm listening to you today on a podcast interview. Now, it might have been recorded 2 months ago. It could have been recorded 2 years ago. And if you direct me to your homepage, my guess is that your homepage is going to change within 2 years. And if I go there and I don't get what I expect, I'll probably just bounce, right? It's that breaking of trust. The other thing too is that when you send them to a dedicated welcome page, this is the only way I've ever been able to see to attribute the traffic. So if you're sending them, like this is an example of a page. Years ago, I was on Jamie Master's podcast, Eventual Millionaire. And so if you go to eventualmillionaire.com interviewvalet.com/EM, I know that you heard me on Jamie's podcast there. And it's the same thing here, right? It's got Jamie's picture, so it's a little bit of a trust seal. We talk about little things. All my social media is on there. And remember those 3 calls to action that we mentioned? Those are on there too. The other thing is we have tested this and it is not ideal to send them to a landing page or a squeeze page. Now, if you don't know what that is, the difference is a landing page typically does not have any navigation on it. So I send you to the squeeze page and you got 2 choices. You can either leave or give me your email address. Why would you want to do that to somebody, right? Especially after they've listened to you for 45 minutes. If they want to look around the website, let them look around the website, right? So once again, if you're not having 3 calls to action, if you're not sending them to a place on your website, right? A dedicated place, you want to be able to measure it. Will you get some conversions? Probably, right? But I look at it, it's almost like fishing for sharks, right? You've gone out there, you've chummed the water, all the sharks are around. Hey, one might jump in the boat. It could, right? But that's not systematic, right? You need those calls to actions, those hooks, and then a place to land them. Number 7. And this one, you've got to look in the mirror on this one and look to your heart. Are you doing this for transactions or relationships? The heart you go into a podcast interview will make a huge, huge difference, right? People can understand it when it's like, hey, I'm here, I want to use and abuse your audience, right? Or I'm here for a relationship. I want to add value. Even how you start out the conversation there before they start the recording. Do you show up prepared? Do you show up grateful? How do you show up to a podcast interview? And then afterwards, do you make the host feel good about it? Like that was a great discussion. I want to keep in touch with this person, or do you ghost them? Right. And you would be amazed how many interviews are either not promoted or don't even get to go live, right? Because the host is just like, man, I just felt like they were trying to use and abuse, right? One of the things that we teach our clients is that your number one goal for being on any podcast is to make the host look like a genius for having you on there, right? I love how Doug Sandler from Nice Guys on Business puts it. He says, you don't have to promote yourself, right? If you do a good job, the host will promote you more than you ever will, right? And if you wanted to get in front of their audience so much one time, why wouldn't you want a relationship so you can get invited back and back, right? Talking about multiple bites at the apple, right? If you want to increase your conversions on a podcast interview, if it converts the first time, have them continue to invite you back. If you ghost them afterwards, not only will you not get invited back, but podcasters know podcasters, and you'll get a reputation for that. I hope this is making sense. And we're on the last couple here before we open it up for questions. Not promoting the interviews. If you want to get more results out of every podcast interview, you can use the content and promote it. And I don't understand why people wouldn't do this. If you're going to invest 45 minutes of your life to get in front of this audience, that you're proud to be there, why wouldn't you invest a little bit more time or money to say that you're there? Right. And it couldn't be not necessarily be your time. You can find people to do that are much better than you at doing this, right? They want to squeeze the most out of every interview. So with that, earlier this year, Tiffany put together a guide. It was one of our best performing guides out there. This is genius, and we're going to do it every year. It's the ultimate guide to promoting your podcast interviews, right? We've started something at Interview Valet. It's called the Commitment to Collaborative Promotion. And we tell every podcast host that, hey, this guest is committed to promoting your podcast interview. That makes a huge difference in whether or not they invite you on as a guest and how much they promote you also. The other thing is not just promoting it, but repurposing it, right? This is such rich content. You could take an interview and get a month's worth of content out of every interview. And once again, in that guide, it talks about how to do that. And I know for a fact that you can do this because it was funny earlier. Well, it was probably 3 years ago. It was pre-COVID. Things typically slow down in podcasting around December. And I remember challenging my team. How much content can you get from one podcast interview? They could get a month's worth of content between the clips, the videos, the cards, the audiograms, the blogs, the articles. This is such rich content, and you can find someone, either on your team or outsource it in order to repurpose that. If you want to get more out of your interview, more return on investment, use more of your interview. Now, the last one that I'm going to put in here, this is a personal one for me. Like I said, IR engineer. And I don't know how you can make decisions if you don't have data, right? Often we'll ask people, how are your podcast interviews going? And they'll say, I think they're okay, or I feel good about it. Well, is that how you make marketing decisions? Is that how you make investment decisions? Even your team, if you're working with somebody and they don't have the data for you, what are they making decisions about? Right? Now, return on investment. I always say when you're on a podcast interviews, there's the qualitative and the quantitative. right? So the qualitative is, hey, we had a great discussion. The host understood what we were talking about. I think he was a great client. Often the audience is like the host or aspires to be like the host. So often after the interview, you sort of got that gut feeling of, I think this is going to be good. But if that's what you're making decisions off of, you're going to have a hard time with that, right? Imagine doing, would you ever do Facebook advertising if they didn't give you all the data with it? Heck no, right? So that data that you need is not only how did it work, right? The attribution of, did you send them to a welcome page? Did you know how many people you were talking to? All of those things. If you don't have that data, it's going to be really, really hard to make any decisions. There's a gentleman I was talking to the other day. I loved this quote. I'm going to give this full screen here. So good. In God we trust. Everyone else better show up with data. So if you don't have the data, you can't make decisions. If the people you're working with don't have the data, you're not going to be able to make the decisions there. It's going to be a feeling. It's going to be a guess. And sometimes people will say, well, you don't understand. With podcasts, there's no data. Well, there's a lot of data out there, right? And we pay way, way too much for about a dozen different databases, right? And so we're using data to make decisions. And each one of these databases tells us another little piece in the puzzle on that. And some of them, the data in it on certain things is downright wrong, right? Listen Notes will tell you everybody's in the top 10% of podcasts. They're not lying to you, but they're comparing themselves to dead podcasts, right? So we work with podcasts in the top 20% of live podcasts because I don't think it's fair to compare yourself to dead people, right? If I did that, I could say I am in the top 7% fittest, most aerobically fit, healthy people in the world. And that's a fact. And you are too. You're in the top 7%. And why? Because 93% of the people that have ever lived in the world are dead. Right. So if somebody tells you they are in the top 1% of podcasts, make sure they're talking about active podcasts or all podcasts. And if you use something like Listen Notes, they're not lying. But if they say they're in the top 1%, multiply that by 10 or 20, and that'll give you of active podcasts. The other thing I would say with data here, if you're looking to do this, sign up for free stuff for the first 30 days. Get as much data as you can. I remember talking with a podcast booker, was an independent, and he said, well, I can't afford to get all of this data. I can't afford that. And I'm like, well, then you're podcast guessing, not podcast guesting. So make sure that, you have the data or the people that you work with have the data. Because there's something that I can promise you. I promise you that after 8 years and over 1,000 clients, that podcast interview marketing works. It's a system. It works. But the other thing that I can promise you is that podcast interview marketing-ish doesn't work. And let me explain this a little bit. Somebody, I remember early on, read the book and goes, do I have to do all of that stuff? Do I have to do the 3 calls to action? Do I have to do the welcome pages? Do I have to do the attribution? Do I have to do all of that to get results? I'm like, you're a grown person. You don't have to do anything, right? I don't know. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I know that recipe works, right? Do you have to put a transmission in a car to make it work? I think most people would agree. Yeah, that works a whole lot better. Or I can think of, I'm going to mess this up. In high school, I was baking a cake for my my girlfriend, right? And it wasn't baking soda or baking powder. One of them it called for, right? I looked at it and I'm like, I don't know what it is. It only called for a little bit of it, right? Now we don't need that. I skipped it, right? Is it important? I didn't like the way it turned out, right? So if you want to try a different system, please try it. Let me know how it works. We can all learn together. But I can tell you that if you follow a podcast interview marketing system, that you get results with that. If you make it up on your own, I don't know. We'll find out. So, a couple things as we wrap up with this. I wanted to share some feedback from other people, and we'll open it up here to questions here too. Um, I think it's important to look at this. And here was just a few people that I thought would very interesting to our conversation here, right? The first one's Carrie Wilkerson. Carrie is an amazing speaker, right? NSA. She was just over in Europe doing a keynote over there. She's known as the Barefoot Executive. She came back and said that after she used our system, her leads increased by a factor of 10, right? Nothing changed with her. It was just her system, right? Another one, Jeffrey Shaw. Jeffrey's the host of the Solopreneur podcast, Solopreneur podcast, one of the top 1% of all podcasts out there. We've done 2 books with him, and he talked about, that brand, right? That he had to be consistent with the brand, and whoever represents you says a lot, right? If you represent yourself, as opposed to having people represent you. Craig Cody, before I said HubSpot, showed us the numbers, but we're not able to share those. I love Craig. He's a CPA. He's got more personality than any accountant I've ever met, right? He's a retired New York City cop. And he publicly said at 1 year, he saw a 600% return on investment. At 2 years, he saw 1,200%, right? And then he'd say, and this, discounts future revenues like an accountant would. But he tracked it. He was able to see those numbers. And then finally, Barbara Turley. Barbara owns the Virtual Hub. She's got an entire team of VAs out there, right? She could go to her own people and have them do that. And what she said is that she's gotten a lot of results and she's gotten a lot of business from podcast interviews working with Interview Valet, right? She's got a whole company of VAs, but she knew that if she worked with somebody that understood the process, that had the relationships, that she could use that process, that would help her drive results. And ultimately, that's what she was focused on. So we're going to open it up for some questions here. And then I've got one thing to talk about at the very end here. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides and let's bring Tiffany back here.
Hello. That was great, Tom. I always enjoy, I always say when we do these presentations, I know the material already, but I still enjoy hearing it. I always learn something myself. Great stuff there. We did have a few questions come through in the comments. Let me find those. The first one, and James, I think I answered this. You asked who on the number 3, that lack of emotional connection, those 2 referenced. You said someone was on a TED Talk. It was either Pat Quinn or Arthur Joseph, right?
Yes, the one on the left was on the TED Talk as Arthur Joseph.
Okay.
Arthur Joseph, if you Google him or Vocal Awareness, that's his program that he does. And he's helped celebrities. He's helped NFL Hall of Fame. In fact, he writes most of the NFL Hall of Fame speeches there.
Wow. That's awesome, right? That's a cool thing to put on your resume. Another question from James was, what is the most important data to keep track of?
And that's great, right? So keeping track of it, right? Because you're going to forget, what did this feel like? What was this podcast? All the rest of that. So one of the things we do is we send out a journal to all of our clients, basically to take notes in there. So when you're on the podcast, take notes on when you were on there, what you talked about, what the calls to action were, where you sent them, when it went live, right? What the estimated downloads were. And if you license the databases, you can see the estimated downloads. I hesitate to ask the host how many downloads they get. I think it's a rude question. It's like asking a woman her weight. It's rude. and you probably won't get the right answer, right? So, okay, or flip that around. Asking a guy how much he can bench press, right?
Right.
I can bench press 350, right? You were thinking pounds. I was thinking grams. I wasn't lying. So keeping track of that. And then even if you're sending them like to a dedicated page, you could run Google Analytics and say how many people came from this. You could ask in your sales process, how did you find out about us? That's pretty raw. If you just asked one data point, right, on your checkout form or when you do your discovery calls to ask, how did you find out about us? They might not remember which podcast, but they would remember that's how they heard about you. So those are all things, and you'll see which ones are the most important after a while on that. And that's also, you can see what stories resonated, right? And a lot of times with our clients, we'll do monthly optimization calls. And they'll say, "Oh, this podcast, we had a great conversation, and man, it did well." We don't just say, "Well, why?" Right? Why? What did you talk about? Let's go back. What was the calls to action? Maybe we need to change that going forward. And I also the data in there, and I've looked up on the comments here real quick. Who measures active podcasts? Okay, so that number comes from Libsyn. So under the terms of service, the hosting company cannot release the data, right, for an individual, but they can do it as aggregate. So Libsyn, which is short for Liberated Syndication, publicly traded company, once a year, they put out the numbers in December that says the top 1% of podcast interviews get 33,000 downloads per episode in the first 30 days. Top 20% get 1,000 downloads per episode in the first 30 days. And that's important, right? Because I don't care how many podcast downloads you've got in lifetime. I care about what you get in a certain time period. And the studies have shown that 80% of the downloads come within the first 30 days. So that's what we're always looking at.
And we had another one, I think, tacking on to the previous data question. Earl asked, what are those databases? As a host, I have no idea the real number of downloads I get per show. I'd love to be able to answer that question with more accuracy.
Mm-hmm. So as a host, depending on what hosting company you go with, right, they give different downloads or they give different analytics packages. And sometimes you have to pay more for them. But if you go into your hosting site, and I'm probably most familiar with Blueberry and Libsyn, but you can go in there and really drill down and see how many downloads there were, when they came, per episode in the last 30 days, what country. It's changed a little bit when Apple changed their update earlier in the year and added a lot more security. And I'm all for security, but they took away some of the tracking of IP addresses. So if you're a host, you can go to your back end there and you can see all that. And if you can't see it, just reach out to your hosting company and they should be able to show that to you. That's not going to count the number. If you put it up on YouTube, it's not going to count that. If you're not a host and you're a guest, there's databases you can license that estimate it with a scary degree of certainty. So the way it's been explained to me is that they buy the data from different players, right? Podcast players, there's lots of them, right? Overcast, Himalaya, iTunes. And so what they'll do is they'll, buy the data, say, from 10% of the market and say, okay, well, if 10% of the market here, these are the numbers, then they just ramp it up from there. But I've been amazed every time I talk with the podcast host and I'm like, hey, this is what our database shows on downloads. What does your show? There've been a lot of them that'll pull up their hosting platform and we can track it. And it's pretty much either spot on or the estimates that we have are a little bit low.
perfect. I think that was a great answer. And that's interesting as a host. It's like, I want to answer this question correctly, and I don't know how to do that. So it's good to know on that side as well, how they can really know their numbers too, because it's not about only knowing your conversion rates for podcast interviews, but as the host too, they might see over time, like this episode did really well, or this guest, or this topic. And so it's good to know on that side as well.
Yeah. And it's, I don't want, in high school, one of my teachers said, figures never lie, but liars often figure. And I don't want to say people are lying, but it's become more of a joke now in the podcasting community. You'll see people post up there that, hey, I've got, my podcast just launched and it's top 1%. And what they're saying and what, Listen Notes is telling them that, right? But it's 1% of all podcasts, right? So if you launch a podcast, as soon as you launch it and you get one listen, you're in the top 20%, right, of all podcasts. So sometimes people will put out information there that is wrong or I don't want to say, unintentional. So just be careful with that, because there's a lot of things that people are making promises that on things that just aren't so.
Right. Yeah. It's easy to say, if you word a statistic the right way, it can sound better than it is, right? Top 1%. Well, of what category, of what, out of what out of the whole podcasts that are in existence. And we know from like the state of podcast interviews that there's like 2 million podcasts, but only a fraction of that pretty much are truly active podcasts. So might make that a statistic sound a little better than it is.
It's going to be interesting to see where the numbers shake out by the end of the year, because I haven't run the report, but I've heard that it's up to 3.5 million podcasts now.
Wow.
But that number of ones that have gone active in the last 30 days is still pretty small, right? So we're still under 500,000 podcasts. And people will say, well, that's a lot. Well, how many blogs are there out there? And, the world doesn't need another podcast, but the world needs another great podcast. And, I hear some people will say, well, how come, I think one lady came to us and she's a client. And she goes, I don't understand why I was on a podcast that I just got 10,000 downloads. And I'm like, 10,000 downloads. I'm just looking at my thing. That's a top 2% podcast we got you on. And she's like, well, I was just on a radio show the other day and was heard by 4 million. And I'm like, what radio show was that? And she goes, oh, I don't remember. It was like out of Indianapolis or something. And I'm like, that was the range or their reach, right? If everybody within the sound of that signal listened to you at that time, that would be 4 million people. I don't think they were all listening to that station at that time. I said the numbers show if they got 10,000 downloads, 70% of the people listen to the entire episode. So it's a little bit different that way.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I'm excited you reported the state of podcast guesting in August at Podcast Movement. So I know that number changed from when we pulled the data earlier this year in February. So I'm excited when we release that again in this upcoming February 2023 of how those numbers have changed again, especially as things are kind of leveling off from the pandemic and we're all kind of settling in. So I'm looking forward to that.
And I'm gonna steal the show here for just a second, because we didn't talk about if you were going to tell the good news on this or I was.
Okay. So do you want to?
With this, I'm so excited about this, right? So
me too.
Podcast Guest Profits Live. All right. We've done this twice. The first time I did it was during COVID, and it was amazing, right? It was a full day event. I think we went from like 8 to 5, right? And I taught everything that I knew in that course, right? I stuck around during breaks to answer questions and everything. Gave everybody a welcome kit that had copy of the book in it, some swag. It had the entire workbook in it. It was a full day seminar, and it was so much fun, but I'm like, that was a lot of work. Right. And so it wasn't until Tiffany came on board and she's like, let's do this again. And we did that. Oh, late summer, we did this, and the
September.
feedback was, the feedback on it was so amazing. I felt like we were helping so many people, and I got a kick out of it. But the feedback we got was that was a long day, and that was for me too. I don't drink Diet Coke, but by like 3 PM, you just see me pounding one after the other. So we've shortened it up a little bit to go from 10 to 3. We'll have a little break for lunch and a break in the morning and afternoon, but it's pretty much content. And the times that are breaks, we'll be around to answer any questions. And we're excited to do this because we know that a lot of people are looking to do podcast interview marketing as part of their 2023 strategic growth plans, right? So we wanted to do this opportunity so that you could learn it, do some things over the holidays, and really hit the ground running come the first of the year.
Right. I think the timing of this is perfect. Yeah, like you said, to hit that, to get ready, to get your ideas, to get your balls in motion, to hit the ground running in January. I'm going to put the link over there. We do have the page up ready to sign up for that, to get all the website has more information on the day, dives into more so what we're going to talk about and how to sign up. And yeah, the feedback on our last one was great. I think the biggest takeaway that we heard from our attendees was they loved being able to pick your brain, right? How many times do you hear that question? And you're like, no, you usually have to shut it down. But this is the chance to do that. And I think it goes beyond your standard virtual event. It's more like a small group coaching atmosphere. The thing they loved most was that one-on-one interaction. I loved that everybody in the group was kind of at different stages in their career and their journey for podcast guesting. And I think we all learned something from each other with that.
It's gonna be a great event there on December 9th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Central Time. We'll start on time, we'll end on time, and I think there's 3 breaks, like a short mid-morning break, a short lunch break, a short afternoon break. But during those breaks, either myself or somebody from our team will be there, to do free one-on-one coaching because we want to make sure that you not only learn it, but are ready to execute on it.
Right. Our goal with the last one and for this one as well is to leave with no question unanswered. That was what we promised. And I think everyone felt that way when they left the day together. And I'm excited to do it again.
Excellent.
All right. Well, I put the link over in the chat. And if you guys have any questions, you're welcome to email or message Tom or myself here on either LinkedIn or our email. My email is just tiffany@interviewvalet.com. And we would love to answer any questions you might have about the content from today or our upcoming event in December. And you guys were a great group today. We thank you, everybody, for spending time with us this morning or this afternoon. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.